Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. Winter, 1916. Verdun lay frozen under a pale gray sky, quiet as a cathedral of stone and frost. The Meuse River crept between the hills like a thin scar. Soldiers stood guard in the silence, stamping their boots to stay warm, unaware that beneath that calm, history was beginning to turn its gears. To them, Verdun was untouchable, a fortress with a soul, too strong to fall. But far to the north, in Berlin, another man studied those same hills with colder eyes. General Erich von Falkenhayn, chief of the German General Staff, believed that France could not be destroyed by conquest, but she could be bled to death. His plan, cold in logic and elegant in cruelty, was called Operation Gericht, judgment. Verdun, he decided, would be the altar upon which France would sacrifice itself. It was a plan not meant for victory, but for exhaustion. Falkenhayn envisioned a trap that would force the French to defend a place they could not lose, throwing their men into the fire until nothing remained. "We will make them come to us," he told his staff. "We will grind them down where they stand." The target had to be symbolic, close enough to Paris to wound pride, yet fortified enough to guarantee a drawn-out defense. Verdun was perfect. Inside France, the illusion of safety persisted. The forts encircling Verdun, Douaumont, Vaux, Souville, were considered impregnable. The French High Command had stripped them of men and guns, believing the sector quiet. Officers filed reports of German movement but received silence in reply. The fog dulled their sight, routine dulled their instincts. Colonel Émile Drian, a veteran of the old wars, sensed the danger. "The quiet," he wrote to his wife, "feels like the silence before a funeral." In February 1916, that silence ended. The first shells came before dawn, hundreds, then thousands. The sky erupted in orange flashes that rolled across the horizon like a storm at sea. Within hours, the ground itself began to move. Trees shattered, trenches vanished, and the air turned black with smoke and iron dust. One French soldier later recalled, "The world no longer existed. Only noise and fire remained." When the bombardment lifted, the German infantry emerged from the mist, hundreds of thousands of men advancing through the wreckage in perfect formation. Their rifles glinted through the haze like metal teeth. The French front line, unprepared and outnumbered, collapsed under the weight of the assault. Villages that had stood for centuries, Haumont, Brabant, Saint-Monieux, disappeared in a single day. Back in the fortress city, officers tried to make sense of the chaos. Orders vanished in the confusion. Communication lines were shredded. The few remaining guns fired blindly into the smoke. Verdun's defenders fought not for position, but for breath. "We were swallowed by the earth," one survivor wrote. "When the light returned, nothing of the world we knew was left." As the Germans advanced, Falkenhayn watched the reports come in with clinical detachment. The plan was working. France had taken the bait. Every hour, reinforcements rushed toward Verdun, the best divisions of the French army marching into a storm they could not stop. The trap had closed. But beneath the precision and logic of the plan lay a darker truth. No one could control what was coming. The machines, the shells, the fire, they were larger than strategy, larger than men. Verdun was no longer a battle waiting to happen. It was a machine awakening, and the sound of its first breath would echo across all of Europe. By the third day, the hills of Verdun no longer resembled France. The bombardment had chewed through forests and villages, turning them into seas of mud and twisted steel. The German guns, over 1,200 of them, pounded the French lines in waves that never stopped. Each shell carried the sound of the earth breaking apart. Men said the air itself had weight, pressing on their lungs until breathing became pain. The French front crumbled under the pressure. Regiments vanished without trace, swallowed by smoke and falling soil. Entire battalions were buried alive when the trenches collapsed. One survivor wrote home, "We dig not for protection, but to bury the dead faster." The sound of the shells merged into something unending, like thunder that forgot to stop. At the village of Haumont, the 51st and 72nd Infantry tried to hold the line. The men fired blindly into fog so thick they could not see their hands. The ground quaked beneath their boots, and the snow was stained the color of iron. When the Germans finally appeared, gray figures emerging from the haze, they moved like ghosts, silent but endless. The French fired until their rifles jammed, then fought with shovels and fists. In the end, they were simply overrun. Colonel Émile Drian's men fought next. They were chasseurs, light infantry, veterans hardened by years of discipline. When the bombardment reached their sector, they had no orders, no reinforcements, and no hope. Still, they stood. For 2 days they fought from shell hole to shell hole, outnumbered 10-1. When their ammunition ran dry, they fixed bayonets and charged into the smoke. Drian was among the last to fall, shot through the temple while covering his men's retreat. The survivors said he died standing. As word of the assault reached Verdun, panic spread through the command. Reports arrived hours late or not at all. The roads clogged with retreating soldiers, horses, and shattered wagons. The few working telephones crackled with desperate voices, calling for artillery that no longer existed. "We are dying alone," one lieutenant whispered over the line before it went silent. In the rear, General Herr struggled to hold his collapsing defenses. The forts that once formed Verdun's pride had been stripped of their guns months earlier, their crews reassigned to other sectors. Fort Douaumont, the largest of them all, stood empty, its garrison reduced to a handful of men who had no idea what was coming. When German stormtroopers reached its walls on February 25th, they found open doors and abandoned corridors. By afternoon, the fortress that symbolized French strength had fallen without a single shot. The news hit France like a blow to the chest. Verdun, once thought untouchable, was bleeding. The government in Paris demanded that it be held at all costs. Reinforcements were rushed in, columns of soldiers marching through sleet and mud, faces hollow with fatigue. Trucks roared down the one surviving road to the city, headlights dimmed, carrying shells, bread, and the living. Each one passed wreckage still burning on the roadside. The soldiers called it the voie sacrée, the sacred way. In the villages behind the front, chaplains gave last rites without asking names. Medics ran out of morphine and bandaged wounds with mud-stained cloth. The dead were buried in trenches alongside the living, for there was no time to separate them. One sergeant wrote, "We are not fighting for victory. We are fighting not to disappear." For the men who fought those first days, time lost meaning. There was only the next barrage, the next collapse, the next scream. The battle had no direction, no front, only circles of destruction spreading wider each hour. Above it all, Falkenhayn believed his plan was working. He read casualty reports like factory output, convinced that France would soon break. Yet in those same numbers, the seeds of his own undoing were already sown. The French were bleeding, but they were not collapsing. The fortress city still stood, and behind it, a quiet figure was preparing to take command, a man whose calm would hold back the tide. By the end of February, Verdun was no longer a city. It was a wound. The air trembled day and night with the rhythm of artillery, and the smoke hung so thick that daylight barely reached the ground. From the shattered hills to the riverbanks, nothing still lived. Horses, men, and machines lay in the same mud. The few who survived moved through it like ghosts, half-deaf, half-blind, waiting for the next shell to find them. In the chaos, a new commander arrived. Philippe Pétain, quiet, methodical, unshaken, stepped into the underground citadel that served as Verdun's heart. He found officers asleep at their desks, reports piled knee-deep, and telegraph wires sparking against stone walls. When his staff asked for orders, he gave only 2 words: "Nous tiendrons." We will hold. Pétain was not the kind of general soldiers expected to save them. He spoke little, listened more, and refused to waste men for pride. But he understood something few others did, that Verdun could not be won by brilliance. It had to be endured by organization. His first act was to restore the lifeline that kept the city alive, the narrow, battered road linking Verdun to Bar-le-Duc. That road became his obsession. He called it the voie sacrée, the sacred way. It was just 67 kilometers long, twisting through mud and shellfire, but it carried everything: shells, bread, water, and men. Pétain turned it into a living artery. Every 30 seconds, a truck rumbled forward. When one broke down, it was pushed aside, and another took its place. Soldiers repaired craters under fire, shoveling gravel into holes made by shells. The engines never stopped. At night, the road glowed faintly red from the brake lights of thousands of trucks. A soldier later wrote, "The road itself seemed alive, breathing, carrying us all into the fire." But Pétain did more than feed the fortress. He changed the way the French army fought. Instead of letting divisions die in place, he rotated them in cycles. A regiment would fight for days, then withdraw to rest while another took its place. It was called the Noria, the water wheel. Slowly, the burden of Verdun spread across all of France. Nearly 3/4 of the entire French army would pass through that line before the year ended. Each man carried home a piece of Verdun in his silence. While Pétain brought order, the battle itself grew stranger. The landscape no longer obeyed the laws of nature. Shells had turned soil into ash and stone into dust. The Meuse River ran black with oil and blood. In some places, the ground boiled from the heat of the bombardments. Soldiers said the earth trembled like a living thing, breathing, groaning, swallowing the dead. For those trapped in the trenches, the senses broke down one by one. The eyes saw only gray. The nose learned to forget the stench. The ears stopped noticing the guns. Some men wrote letters with hands that no longer felt cold or fear, only the weight of the rifle they could not let go. "Verdun is not a battle," one lieutenant wrote in his journal. "It is a condition of existence." On the German side, the plan had begun to change. Falkenhayn's idea of controlled attrition, of bleeding France dry, was dissolving in reality. Every kilometer gained demanded another river of blood. The terrain itself defied conquest. Supply lines stretched thin, and men collapsed from exhaustion long before reaching the front. German officers called the place Die Blutmühle, the blood mill. The Crown Prince, who had once promised his father that Verdun would break France's spirit, now wrote in his diary, "We are devoured by our own machine." But for Pétain, every minute that passed without collapse was victory. He didn't speak of triumph, only of endurance. He reminded his men that Verdun was the heart of France, and that a heart could still beat even when surrounded by ruin. His orders were clear and calm, his words repeated like prayer. "Courage, on les aura." Courage, we will get them. The soldiers believed him. They had no choice. In the tunnels of the citadel, under the rumble of distant guns, men whispered his name like a promise. Pétain was not fighting for glory or land. He was fighting to keep Verdun breathing. By March, the Germans still advanced, but slower. Their momentum was fading, drowned in the mud they had created. Verdun, the fortress meant to fall quickly, had become something else entirely, a trap that consumed not only the French, but the very army that had built it. March 1916. Verdun had become a living storm. For weeks, day and night, the German artillery rained down fire without pause. The sky itself seemed to burn. The thunder of guns rolled like the heartbeat of a dying world. Men no longer measured time by sunrise or sunset, but by barrages. The brief silences between them felt like hours of mercy. On both banks of the Meuse, the ground dissolved under the weight of shells. Hills flattened, forests disappeared, and the air shimmered with dust. The French front lines were little more than strings of craters connected by mud and corpses. Soldiers who once feared death now feared losing their senses. The constant noise cracked something inside them. They said the earth no longer sounded like thunder, but like an endless scream. Yet through that chaos, Pétain's calm voice held. From his headquarters beneath Verdun citadel, he sent simple, steady orders. Hold the line, repair the road, rotate the men. He turned endurance into rhythm, survival into routine. When supplies faltered, he rode to the sacred way himself, standing in the cold rain as convoys passed. Drivers saluted him with hands wrapped in rags. To them, he was not just a general. He was proof that someone above the mud still cared. Every soldier who came to Verdun carried the same fear, that he would never leave. Some were barely 18, others veterans of the Marne. They wrote home about the same things: mud that reached their knees, rats the size of cats, and the smell that clung to their skin no matter how they washed. "The air tastes of metal," one wrote. "Even when you eat, it feels like you're swallowing smoke." On March 6th, the Germans struck again, this time for the Western Heights, Morts and Côte 304. If they could take those hills, they could look down on Verdun itself. The bombardment was so intense that whole battalions vanished beneath collapsing slopes. The French called Morts the Hill of Death. The Germans, less poetic, called it simply Totenberg. Both names meant the same. Men fought for days without water or food. Positions changed hands 5 times in a single night. Shells unearthed the dead faster than they could be buried, and the wounded crawled into shell holes beside the corpses to escape the next blast. "It was not war," a German private wrote. "It was the earth opening to eat us." When the French counterattacked, they advanced over terrain that no longer existed, craters filled with smoke and fire, where even trees had turned to dust. In the midst of this madness, faith became the only weapon left. Soldiers carried tiny crucifixes in their breast pockets or whispered the names of their children before going over the top. Some carved prayers into their rifle stocks. A French chaplain, exhausted and filthy, wrote in his diary, "We no longer ask God for victory, only for one more sunrise." And still, Pétain's system held. The Noria rotation, his wheel of men, kept turning. Each regiment that left Verdun was replaced within hours. They came from every corner of France: miners from the north, farmers from the Loire, clerks from Paris, and all of them left something behind. The nation itself was flowing through Verdun, piece by piece, as if France were feeding her own heart with her own blood. But on the German side, Falkenhayn's theory was unraveling. His army was bleeding almost as fast as the French. For every fortress taken, a division was spent. Officers wrote that morale was crumbling. The men could not stand the sight of the wounded convoys or the smell of the battlefield. They called Verdun die Blutpumpe, the blood pump. The Crown Prince, commanding the Fifth Army, confessed to his father that they were trapped. "We hold the enemy in our claws," he wrote, "but we cannot let go without losing our own hands." By April, the battle had become a paradox. Both sides convinced they were winning because neither could stop. For the French, every hill held meant survival. For the Germans, every hill taken meant hope. Verdun was no longer about ground, it was about will. And as long as Pétain's orders flowed down the sacred way, France refused to die. In the rare moments between bombardments, when the guns fell silent and the mist rolled in, soldiers could hear birds for the first time in weeks. The sound was so fragile, so absurd amid the ruins, that men cried quietly in their trenches. For a heartbeat, the world felt alive again. Then the next shell fell, and Verdun returned to fire. By late March, Verdun had swallowed everything but the will to endure. The left bank of the Meuse, those grim hills of Morts and Côte 304, had become the furnace of the battle. Every shell that fell there seemed to strike the same ground again and again until the earth itself forgot its shape. Nothing green remained, no birds, no trees, no life, only smoke drifting across a world reduced to bone and mud. The Germans believed these heights held the key to Verdun. From them, their artillery could dominate the French positions across the river. Falkenhayn poured everything he had into the assault: thousands of men, millions of shells, the full weight of his empire. The French, under Pétain's quiet command, were told to hold no matter the cost. And so both sides climbed the same ruined hills, day after day, into the same inferno. The bombardment began before dawn. For 6 hours, the sky flickered like lightning as shells rained down without pause. The air became a solid thing, thick, choking, filled with dust and fire. When the guns fell silent, a deeper terror began. From the fog rose figures, gray and black, the silhouettes of men advancing through smoke so dense they seemed to appear out of nowhere. The French opened fire, rifles shaking in their hands. The bullets cut through mist and screams alike. And then, as always, the shelling began again. One soldier from Lorraine wrote in his notebook, "It is not a hill, it is a pit where God has forgotten his children." His friend beside him was hit moments later, vanishing into the mud. Another, from Bavaria, scribbled a line in his journal before being sent forward. "We live like moles and die like flies. The rain never stops. The earth stinks of metal and men." Letters like these never reached their homes. They were found later, soaked in blood, sealed forever in the mud that had become their grave. The fighting for more Ohm was beyond strategy. The hills changed hands so many times that no one knew who held them anymore. Men advanced, retreated, and advanced again, sometimes crossing the same crater 5 times in a single day. Trenches vanished under the bombardment, and maps became useless. Commanders gave up trying to count the dead. The French said the hill moaned at night, as if the ground itself remembered the pain. Inside Verdun, Pétain listened to the reports in silence. Thousands gone in hours, entire units wiped out. Yet his voice, when it came, was steady. "Hold fast," he said. "You are France." Those words spread along the trenches like a heartbeat. The soldiers repeated them to each other in the dark, not because they believed they would live, but because it gave their suffering meaning. The road behind them, the sacred way, still pulsed with life. Convoys thundered through rain and smoke, drivers steering by memory and instinct. Mechanics repaired engines under shell fire. Priests blessed trucks instead of men, and the living stepped over the dead to keep the line moving. Every loaf of bread, every shell, every drop of fuel came at the cost of another life. Verdun had become a machine that ran on sacrifice. The Germans pressed on through April, but the harder they pushed, the slower they moved. The slopes of Mort Homme were no longer ground, but liquid mud. Shells exploded beneath the surface, launching geysers of corpses and debris. Gas clung to the hollows like fog, and men drowned in holes filled with water and blood. "It's not war," one French captain said. "It's a geological event. When the last German attack of the month failed, neither side could claim victory. The line had barely shifted. The hill had not been conquered. It had been erased. The French still held its ruins, and the Germans still shelled them, though there was nothing left to destroy. Verdun had become its own world now, one where daylight meant death and night meant nothing. And yet, through that hell, a strange faith endured. The soldiers began to call Verdun the altar of France. They said the nation was being reborn there, purified by fire. They did not say it with pride, but with quiet resignation, as if they were witnesses to something sacred and terrible. From afar, Falkenhayn studied his maps and casualty charts, convinced that France must soon break. But those who fought at Verdun no longer cared about victory. They fought only because there was no other choice. On the hill of death, hope had burned away. What remained was duty, and a grim kind of love for the men beside them. By April 1916, Verdun was a wound that refused to close. Every hill and hollow around the Meuse had been smashed into powder, every tree burned to charcoal. The roar of artillery never stopped. It echoed from the sky, from the earth, from the bones of the living. Men said even the wind carried the sound of the guns. France was dying, but not yet dead. In the last days of February, as the front teetered on collapse, Philippe Pétain had arrived quietly in the city. He came without fanfare, his boots caked in mud, his coat heavy with rain. The officers who greeted him expected urgency. Instead, he spoke softly, almost calm. He listened to reports of entire divisions gone, forts captured, and roads destroyed. Then, after a long silence, he said the words that would define Verdun: "Nous tiendrons." We will hold. Pétain was unlike any general the men had known. He did not promise glory or victory. He promised survival, and that was enough. His strength was order, not passion. He studied the chaos like a physician studying a patient near death, searching for a pulse. That pulse was the road, the voie sacrée. Under his direction, it became the lifeline of Verdun. Trucks thundered down its length every 30 seconds, headlights dimmed, engines straining under the weight of shells and supplies. When a vehicle broke down, it was pushed aside within minutes. Mechanics worked under bombardment, their hands trembling but precise. The road was never empty, not for a moment. Soldiers said it glowed red at night, like an artery beneath the skin of France. Through that artery, Pétain fed not just the city, but the army's will to fight. He established a rotation system, the Noria, that moved units in and out of the line before they shattered. No division was left to die alone. Every man who survived a rotation carried his story home, and every new arrival came knowing that France had not abandoned Verdun. In time, 3/4 of the entire French army would serve there. Verdun became the crucible through which the nation passed. Pétain's leadership was not built on speeches, but on presence. He visited the front himself, walking among the trenches, speaking to soldiers by name. He asked about their food, their boots, their sleep. He carried cigarettes in his coat and handed them out without ceremony. "How are you holding up?" he would ask. And the men, filthy and half-mad, would straighten their backs before answering. To them, he was not just a general. He was proof that France still existed above the mud. As spring deepened, the Germans continued their assault. The hills of Mort-Homme and Côte 304 were still ablaze, their soil reduced to fine ash. The bombardments came in endless waves, shaking even the ground beneath Pétain's headquarters. Yet he refused to retreat. He believed Verdun had become something larger than a battle. It was a test of endurance, a duel of national wills. And endurance, he believed, was France's truest strength. For every shell the Germans fired, the French answered with one of their own. Spotter planes buzzed over the valley, their wings shimmering in the smoke. Beneath them, gunners worked with machine precision, firing until their hands bled. The sky flashed with constant fire, day merging into night. "We are no longer men," one soldier wrote. "We are instruments of the guns." In this inferno, Pétain's calm became legend. His staff described him as a man carved from granite. Even when news arrived that forts had fallen and villages were gone, he merely adjusted his plans. He moved men like pieces on a chessboard, not with indifference, but with discipline. For him, every delay, every hour held, was a victory measured in survival. By May, the tide of the German assault was slowing. The enemy's strength was being consumed by the same fire it had unleashed. Falkenhayn's machine of destruction had begun to eat itself. Verdun was no longer just France's agony. It was Germany's too. One French officer wrote, "We are winning nothing, but we are losing less." It was the only kind of victory left. In the trenches, men still died by the thousands, but they did not break. The sacred way still flowed. The Noria still turned. And in the heart of that storm, Pétain's promise still held. "Nous tiendrons." We will hold. Because Verdun was not a place anymore. It was a state of mind, a heartbeat that refused to stop. By late April, Verdun had become more than a battlefield. It was a pit that devoured everything sent into it. The left bank of the Meuse, where Mort-Homme and Côte 304 rose like broken teeth from the mud, had turned into the center of the storm. The air trembled constantly, filled with the roar of shells that seemed to come from every direction at once. Smoke hid the sun. The ground shook even when the guns were silent. The Germans threw their full strength against those hills, believing they were the last barrier before Verdun itself. Falkenhayn ordered that they be taken whatever the cost. Those words would bury tens of thousands. The bombardment began on March 6th and did not stop for days. The soil turned to liquid. The trenches filled with bodies faster than they could be cleared. Men drowned where they stood, swallowed by the mud that was half earth, half flesh. For the soldiers, Mort-Homme was not a hill, but a vision of hell. One French private wrote home, "The earth here breathes. It moves under us, as if alive." Another, from the German 10th Regiment, confessed in his diary, "We are living among the dead. When the fog lifts, they stare at us, as if waiting for us to join them." Letters like these rarely reached their families. Most were buried with their authors. The hills changed hands again and again, each side clawing over the same craters. The French fought with bayonets, grenades, and bare hands. The Germans came in waves only to vanish under counterfire. Every foot of ground was paid for with 100 lives. The shelling never stopped. It was a drumbeat that replaced thought itself. Soldiers went deaf, then mad. Some laughed uncontrollably, others sat and stared at nothing until the next barrage ended them. A French lieutenant described it simply, "There is no sky, no ground, no men, only fire. Behind the lines, Petain's machine of survival kept turning. The Voie Sacrée still pulsed like a living vein, trucks rolling through the rain every 30 seconds. When the road filled with craters, engineers filled them with stones, wreckage, and sometimes the bodies of dead horses. The convoy never stopped. "Even the road bleeds," one driver wrote. In the command post, Petain's voice remained steady. His orders were brief, deliberate. Hold the left bank, maintain the road, rotate the divisions. He refused to abandon the hills, though they were little more than ashes. "Every hour we hold," he told his staff, "is another nail in their coffin." And so, hour by hour, men died to buy those nails. The Crown Prince, watching from the German side, began to despair. His divisions were breaking. Reports spoke of soldiers trembling uncontrollably, refusing to advance, hiding in shell holes until the barrage passed. But there was no retreat. Verdun had become a machine without an off switch. By May, the left bank had turned into a vast graveyard. The forest that once covered the hills was gone. Its stumps burned black, its roots churned into the soil. The rain returned, heavy and cold, filling the craters until they overflowed. The dead floated in them, unburied, nameless. Men drank that same water because there was nothing else. In one of his last letters, a French soldier wrote, "The mud pulls at our boots like hands. Sometimes it does not let go. The night smells of metal and decay. But still, we hold." And hold they did, against logic, against exhaustion, against the weight of the entire German army. The hill itself was gone, leveled by months of bombardment, but the idea of it, the belief that Verdun must never fall, remained. When the Germans finally stopped their assault, nothing was left to capture. The line had not moved, and yet the world had changed. The land was dead. The men were ghosts. But Verdun still stood. For the first time, the French believed they might survive, not because they were stronger, but because they had learned to outlast death itself. By early May 1916, Verdun was a tomb that refused to close. The front had dissolved into a landscape of smoke and shattered concrete. The forts that once protected the city now stood like broken teeth along the ridgeline, symbols not of safety, but of the price of pride. And none loomed larger or more cursed than Fort Douaumont. The Germans had taken Douaumont with barely a fight in February, walking through open doors left unguarded. Since then, the massive fortress, once the crown jewel of Verdun's defenses, had become a shelter and a prison. Its tunnels were packed with thousands of German soldiers, living in the dark like miners, surrounded by the stench of oil, smoke, and decay. The air inside was foul, heavy with damp and rot. Even whispers echoed through its stone corridors like sighs. On the morning of May 8th, a spark changed everything. In a lower chamber, a group of soldiers was heating coffee near a stockpile of flamethrower fuel and grenades. A single flame caught. Then came a flash, followed by a roar that tore through the fort's belly. Fire and smoke filled the galleries, rolling through the tunnels faster than men could run. Those who tried to escape were consumed by the flames. Others suffocated in sealed chambers, their lungs bursting from the heat. By the time the fire burned out, more than 800 Germans were dead, killed not by the enemy, but by their own carelessness. The explosion was visible for miles. From the French lines, black smoke rose over Douaumont like a funeral pyre. Commanders believed the Germans were in disarray, and for the first time in weeks, hope flickered through the chaos. General Nivelle, newly in command after Petain's reassignment, saw an opportunity to retake the fort. He ordered an assault. The artillery opened fire that night. Hundreds of guns thundering in unison, pounding Douaumont for hours. When the barrage lifted, waves of French infantry surged forward through the mud and gas. They reached the walls under cover of smoke, forcing their way into the lower galleries. For a brief moment, the tricolor flag fluttered again above the fort that had become a national wound. But the victory did not last. The Germans counterattacked before dawn, throwing grenades and flamethrowers down the corridors. The French, trapped inside the smoke-filled tunnels, fought until their rifles melted in their hands. When the fighting ended, the fort was once again in German hands. The bodies of both sides lay together in the dark, indistinguishable in death. One survivor later wrote, "We could not tell which language the dying spoke. For days after, the smell of burned flesh hung over the battlefield. The fire at Douaumont had turned the fort into a tomb, a monument to the futility of war. The French High Command called it a heroic attempt. The soldiers who survived called it madness. We went in men," one wrote, "and came out shadows. Outside, the rain began again. It soaked the ruins, washing blood and ashes down the slopes into the Meuse. The ground was slick, the air thick with smoke and gas. In the lowlands, the bodies of the fallen drifted together in pools of black water. Even the crows had stopped coming. Still, both sides refused to stop. Falkenhayn demanded another push. Verdun must fall. The French government ordered that it must not. Between those two absolutes, thousands more men died. By June, the battle had entered its most senseless phase. The forts, once symbols of strength, were now nothing but targets. The soldiers who fought for them knew this. They no longer spoke of victory, only of endurance. One French gunner wrote, "We no longer fight for France. We fight for the man beside us because no one else will." Above them, the ruins of Douaumont smoked under the gray sky, a warning to both armies. Verdun was no longer a contest of nations or generals. It had become something darker, a war between the living and the dead were winning. Fort Vaux lay a few kilometers south of Douaumont. Smaller, darker, forgotten by most until the fire reached it. Its corridors were narrow, its walls cracked from months of shelling. For weeks, the garrison inside had watched the smoke rising from Douaumont and knew their turn was coming. By early June 1916, the fort was surrounded. Major Sylvain Raynal, its commander, had 600 men, infantry, engineers, medics, and clerks. There would be no reinforcements, no rescue, only orders. Hold. The bombardment began on June 1st. German artillery struck with such precision that parts of the fort collapsed in on themselves. Stones rained from the ceilings, lamps shattered. The air filled with dust and gas until breathing became agony. "We could taste the stone," one defender wrote. "The walls were dissolving around us." The men moved through the darkness coughing blood, the light from their candles trembling like dying stars. The first assault came on June 2nd. German stormtroopers advanced through smoke and fire, carrying flamethrowers and grenades. They broke through the outer defenses, but Raynal's men met them in the tunnels, fighting in total darkness. Bayonets flashed against helmets. Grenades rolled down the corridors. Screams echoed off the walls. The French held. When the fighting stopped, the floor was slick with oil and blood. The men sat among the bodies and reloaded in silence. As days passed, their world shrank. The bombardment destroyed the ventilation shafts. Smoke and heat built up inside. The temperature rose above 40 degrees. Water ran out. Men licked condensation from the walls, shared drops from canteens, and passed buckets of urine for the wounded to wet their lips. When communications failed, Raynal released his last carrier pigeon, numbered 78715. Its message read, "We are still holding, but without water. It will soon be the end." The bird reached Verdun, half blind and dying from gas exposure. The French awarded it the Legion of Honor, the only pigeon ever to receive it. Inside the fort, sanity began to fray. Some soldiers screamed for water, clawing at the walls. Others whispered prayers, their voices faint in the heat. The wounded begged to be shot rather than left behind. "There are no heroes here," Raynal wrote in his notebook. "Only men who refuse to die thirsty." On June 5th, the Germans breached the main gallery. They poured fire through the tunnels, flamethrowers lighting the darkness like the mouth of hell. The defenders fell back chamber by chamber, retreating deeper underground. By June 7th, only a handful of men were still able to fight. Raynal, exhausted, his uniform soaked in sweat and soot, gathered them in the command post. He gave his last order: cease fire. The Germans who entered found him sitting among the wounded, revolver still in hand, surrounded by the bodies of his men. The Crown Prince himself visited the fort the next day, and in rare respect sent Raynal a sword to replace the one he had broken in battle. Even the enemy could not deny what he had done. When news reached France, It was received like gospel. Newspapers printed Raynal's name beside words like honor and sacrifice. The army spoke of Fort Vaux as if it were a cathedral of courage. But for those who had fought there, it was simply a tomb. They had not won, but they had not surrendered their humanity. Outside, the battle continued as if nothing had changed. The Germans prepared to move on the next fortress, Souville, the last before Verdun itself. Falkenhayn believed the French could not endure another blow. But he was wrong. Verdun had learned to survive on defiance alone. The men who escaped Fort Vaux were carried down the sacred way in silence. Their faces were burned, their lips cracked and bleeding. When asked how long they had lasted, one of them whispered, 6 days. Then, after a pause, he added, an eternity. Fort Vaux had fallen, but it had given France something no victory could. A story. In a war that had forgotten the meaning of heroism, it reminded the world that courage could still exist in the dark. By mid-June 1916, Verdun was no longer a place. It was a state of madness that had spread through both armies. The hills were stripped bare, the trees gone, the soil churned to dust. The Meuse Valley glowed at night with the flash of endless bombardment, a horizon of fire that never moved. Men who entered Verdun no longer believed they would leave. Those who did were silent, as if the language to describe it had died somewhere in the smoke. The Germans pressed on. After Fort Vaux fell, they turned their guns toward Souville, the last height before Verdun itself. The attack began with phosgene gas, invisible clouds that drifted over the French trenches in the early hours of June 22nd. Men awoke choking, clawing at their throats, their eyes bleeding. Whole companies collapsed without firing a shot. Those who survived staggered through the fog, vomiting and blind, guided only by the sound of their own coughing. The air itself kills us, one soldier wrote before collapsing on his page. Still, the French line held. Petain's careful rotations kept the army from breaking, even as every new division arrived weaker than the one before. The Voix Sacrée thundered night and day, trucks grinding over the stones like the pulse of a dying body. Drivers tied scarves over their faces to keep out the dust and the stench. Mechanics worked by lantern light beside piles of wrecked vehicles. The road was never silent, not once. Behind the front, in the hospitals of Bar-le-Duc, the wounded filled every corridor. Doctors amputated by the hundreds each day. The smell of ether, blood, and burnt flesh clung to the walls. A nurse wrote in her journal, "They come without names. Some cannot speak. We tag them with numbers until they remember who they are." For many, memory never returned. Across the lines, the Germans were dying too. Falkenhayn's army was bleeding as fast as the French. Supply columns bogged down in mud. Horses collapsed by the thousands. Whole regiments vanished into the trenches and never reappeared. Officers began to question the plan. "We are not bleeding France white," one major wrote to his wife. "We are drowning in our own blood." By July, the world beyond Verdun had caught fire. On the Somme, British and French armies launched a new offensive, and the thunder of their guns rolled across northern France like distant echoes of Verdun's storm. In the east, Russia bled itself dry in the Brusilov offensive. Everywhere, the war was devouring men faster than nations could replace them. Europe itself seemed to be dissolving. At Verdun, sanity was the rarest commodity left. Men muttered to themselves in the dark, unable to tell whether the vibrations they felt were from the guns or from their own hearts. Sleep came only in fragments, between barrages. Food arrived soaked in mud. Water carried the taste of decay. "We are made of earth now," a French corporal wrote. "When we die, it will not notice." Even the generals began to lose faith. Falkenhayn, still convinced that France would collapse any day, refused to call off the attack. Pétain, now overseeing the broader front, warned Paris that the army was near breaking. But neither side could stop. Verdun had become a ritual of death that demanded continuation. On the front line, men found new ways to stay alive inside the madness. Some carried photographs of their families wrapped in oilcloth. Others scratched prayers into their rifle butts. When they could, they traded food across the lines in the dark. Cigarettes for bread, a moment of shared humanity in a place that had forgotten the word. In the silence, one German soldier wrote, We can hear the French breathing. They are as afraid as we are. By the end of July, the Germans had reached the slopes of Fort Souville. From its ruined summit, they could see the church spires of Verdun itself. But they could go no further. Exhausted, half-starved, and buried under their own artillery fire, they stopped. The French counterattacked and pushed them back down the hill. Verdun, though barely alive, had not fallen. It was at that moment that the meaning of the battle changed. Verdun was no longer about victory. It was about endurance, about how long a human being, a nation, a world could stare into hell and not look away. By the end of summer 1916, Verdun had consumed 500,000 men and still refused to decide. The front lines barely moved. Every hill, every trench, every ruined fort had been fought over so often that no one remembered what they looked like before. Verdun was no longer a battle. It was an equation that refused to balance. In Berlin, the truth could no longer be hidden. Falkenhayn's plan to bleed France white had bled Germany just as deeply. The Crown Prince's Fifth Army was exhausted. Morale had collapsed. Divisions sent to Verdun returned half their size, hollow-eyed and silent. Even officers stopped pretending to believe in the plan. "We have reached the point," one wrote, "where victory and defeat are the same." On August 29, 1916, the Kaiser dismissed Falkenhayn. The man who had conceived Verdun as a calculated slaughter was gone. In his place came Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the architects of total war. Their first order was simple: stop the offensive. The guns did not fall silent overnight, but their rhythm changed. The once relentless storm became scattered, hesitant, tired. For the first time in 6 months, the French dared to breathe. Across the lines, General Pétain watched with grim satisfaction. He had spent months turning chaos into endurance, and now that endurance was paying off, the Germans had burned themselves out. Yet Verdun was still bleeding, and the men who fought there had no sense of triumph, only exhaustion. "We are not winning," one captain wrote. "We are surviving better." When General Robert Nivelle replaced Pétain in direct command of the Verdun sector, few understood how different he was. Pétain was patient, cautious, a builder of systems. Nivelle was precise, ambitious, and believed that victory could be engineered like a formula. "Fire conquers," he told his officers. He meant it literally. If enough guns fired long enough, the enemy would vanish. Verdun would prove it. Through September and October, the French prepared their counteroffensive. The Voix Sacrée roared once more. Convoys of trucks, endless columns of men, new artillery rolling toward the front. Observation balloons floated above the ruined hills, mapping every trench and crater. The sky was filled with reconnaissance planes, their engines growling through the smoke. Every shell, every coordinate, every movement was planned. Nivelle intended not just to hold Verdun, but to reclaim it. On October 20th, the guns began their song. For days, Verdun shook as 700 French artillery pieces hammered the German lines. The bombardment was so relentless that German prisoners later said they thought the world had ended. When the infantry advanced on October 24th, they moved behind a creeping wall of explosions that rolled forward like a living storm. Within hours, they reached Fort Douaumont, the fortress whose fall had symbolized France's humiliation 8 months earlier. Now its walls were cracked, its halls filled with smoke and corpses. The French pushed through the rubble, bayonets flashing in the dark. By afternoon, the tricolor flag flew once more over its shattered dome. The men who raised it wept, though they did not know if it was from pride or relief. Paris erupted in celebration. For the first time since February, the headlines did not speak of loss, but of recovery. "Douaumont reclaimed!" the papers cried. Crowds gathered on the boulevards, singing the Marseillaise. Yet at Verdun, there was no singing, only the low hum of the guns, and the quiet understanding that the battle was not over. Nivelle struck again on November 2nd. After another brutal bombardment, Fort Vaux was retaken. The French soldiers who entered found only ghosts, names scratched into the walls, the smell of mold and ashes, and the silence of a place that had already died once. "The fort was empty," one man wrote, "but it felt alive. We could still feel them here, the ones who fought, the ones who thirsted. For the Germans, it was the beginning of the end. Their lines were collapsing. Their soldiers fought without faith or purpose. The Crown Prince wrote in his diary, "Verdun has become a black memory. We have gained nothing but death." The dream of breaking France had vanished into the mud. By December, the French had regained nearly all the ground lost since February. The front had stabilized. The fires still burned, but the wind was changing. Verdun, once a symbol of despair, was now a monument to survival. As the snow began to fall, a soldier from Normandy wrote in his diary, "We thought we were defending Verdun, but now I see Verdun was defending us." The world beyond the Meuse kept fighting, the Somme, the Isonzo, the endless fronts. But Verdun had already shown what the new century of war would mean. It would not be decided by strategy or courage, but by who could endure longest in the dark. Winter came to Verdun like a quiet executioner. The smoke thinned, the mud hardened into ice, and the guns fell silent, only for new ones to begin again. The hills that once glowed red with fire now stood gray and skeletal, crowned by snow and ruin. Yet through the silence, a new rhythm began to rise. It was the sound of France returning. After 10 months of agony, the French army was no longer the same force that had begun the battle. It was leaner, harder, stripped of illusion. Under Nivelle's command, the army had turned endurance into method. No longer reacting to the enemy, they now dictated the rhythm of the war. The motto had changed. Ils ne passeront pas, they shall not pass, had become nous reviendrons, we shall return. By mid-December 1916, Nivelle prepared the final push to reclaim the last of Verdun's lost ground. He had reorganized the artillery, improved the supply lines, and learned every contour of the ruined landscape. It was no longer a blind slaughter. It was a calculated storm. The goal was simple: destroy the remaining German positions on the right bank and erase the humiliation of February once and for all. On the morning of December 15th, Verdun awoke once more to thunder. 8:30 French guns opened fire in perfect synchronization, their flashes turning the dawn sky to gold and ash. The earth trembled for hours. The German trenches, already crumbling, simply disappeared. When the barrage lifted, waves of French infantry advanced, fresh, disciplined, and filled with a strange calm. They moved behind a creeping barrage, their boots crunching through the frost, stepping over the bones of friends and enemies alike. Machine guns rattled weakly in reply, but the defenders were broken. The German front collapsed in less than 2 days. Villages that had been nothing but names on a map, Fort Douaumont, Hardemont, were retaken. By December 18th, the French had reached their original lines. Verdun was whole again. This time, there were no cheers. The soldiers did not raise their rifles or sing. They simply stood in the snow, staring at the ruins that had once been their homeland's pride. The forts were gutted, the forests gone, the rivers poisoned with oil and ash. "We have returned," one sergeant said quietly, "but there's nothing left to return to." In Paris, newspapers called it a victory. The politicians declared Verdun saved. Pétain was promoted, Nivelle hailed as a genius, the tricolor flown from every window. But among the men who had fought there, victory was a word that no longer meant anything. They had not conquered. They had endured. One artilleryman wrote home, "We are ghosts walking through what was once France. The ground is sick. The trees are dead. Even the birds avoid this place." Another described the silence that followed the battle. No gunfire, no orders, just wind moving through ruins that smell of iron. And yet, beneath that silence, something deeper stirred, a quiet pride, the knowledge that France had not broken. Verdun had tested the nation's limits and found them unshakable. It was not triumph that the soldiers carried home, but certainty, that courage was not noise, but persistence, not the act of killing, but of surviving when every reason to live had been stripped away. The Germans withdrew northward, leaving behind their dead and their disbelief. The Crown Prince called Verdun a cemetery of honor. To the French, it was sacred ground. Priests came to bless the ruins, and families traveled hundreds of miles to search for the names of the missing, though there were few names left to find. When the last guns fell silent, snow began to fall again, soft and white over the blackened soil. The snow did what neither army could. It covered everything. For a few weeks, Verdun looked peaceful again, but those who had been there knew better. Beneath that white silence lay the bones of 300,000 men. The world would remember Verdun as a victory, but those who fought it would remember something else: the price of being human in a war that had forgotten humanity. When the guns finally stopped in December 1916, Verdun was silent for the first time in nearly a year. The silence was not peace. It was exhaustion. It lay heavy over the hills, over the forest that no longer existed, over the trenches filled with mud and the unnamed dead. Verdun had survived, but what remained of it was barely a place. It was a wound carved into the earth, still bleeding long after the fighting had ceased. More than 300,000 men were dead, and nearly twice as many wounded. The rivers ran brown with soil and blood. The air reeked of iron and decay. Even the birds refused to return. When the spring thaw came, the ground shifted, and the bones of the fallen surfaced like seeds breaking through the soil. Entire villages had vanished, destroyed so completely that they were never rebuilt. On French maps, they would forever carry the same epitaph: died for France. And yet somehow Verdun became more than ruin. For the French people, it became a symbol of endurance, of defiance, of the refusal to surrender even when reason itself demanded it. "Verdun is not a victory," one veteran said. "It is proof that we did not die in vain." Across France, mothers whispered the word Verdun as a prayer and a curse. School children learned its name before they learned the Marne or the Somme. In the years to come, the soldiers who had survived it would march again, some in parades, others back to the front lines in another war that the world swore would never come. But they carried Verdun with them always. For the Germans, Verdun was something darker, a mirror they did not wish to look into. It had begun as their plan to break France's spirit, but it ended as a lesson in their own mortality. Falkenhayn's logic of attrition, the idea that war could be won through calculated bloodletting, died at Verdun. It proved that industrial war had no victors, only survivors. After the armistice, the battlefield was left untouched. It was too dangerous to rebuild, too sacred to erase. When the French government declared the area Red Land, it meant it literally: red with rust, red with bodies, red with the memory of what humanity could do to itself. A single ossuary was built at Douaumont, its tower rising above the shattered horizon. Inside, the bones of 130,000 unidentified soldiers, French and German alike, lie side by side. No flags, no names, no ranks, only bones. Visitors today describe Verdun as eerily quiet. The grass has grown back, but the ground still hums faintly when the wind passes over it. Locals say it is the sound of the dead breathing beneath the earth. Every year, wild poppies bloom along the old trenches, red as blood, fragile as memory. But Verdun's legacy is not just in the soil. It lives in the way we understand war itself. It taught the world that modern battle is not glory, but machinery, that courage can coexist with futility, and that endurance can be both a virtue and a tragedy. It revealed that nations, like men, can survive wounds they should not have survived, and that survival alone can sometimes be victory enough. In the years after the Great War, one French soldier returned to the battlefield. He found the spot where his company had been wiped out and stood there for hours, saying nothing. When asked why he came back, he answered softly, "Because they are still here. Verdun never left those who fought there. It never left France. It never left the world. It remains, even now, the place where humanity learned just how much suffering it could endure before breaking, and how, somehow, it did not break. Verdun was not won, it was endured,